What is happening, horror freaks? James Hancock here. Just got out of seeing Suspiria, Luca Guadagnino's reimagining of Dario Argento's 1977 classic. This movie's in very limited release right now, so I will refrain from any spoilers until I give you fair warning. But before I get to my official review, I just want to say remaking beloved horror films is always a risky venture. Remaking what is arguably the most famous horror film ever to come out of the country of Italy is even more so. What's funny is how Italy is so famous for its horror films, but for a long time horror films couldn't even get released in the country. Under Mussolini, there was a strict ban, and it basically took until about the late 50s before Italians developed a taste for watching and making horror films. But once they did, they more than made up for lost time. Because basically through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had all these brilliant filmmakers like Mario Bava and Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci redefining what horror meant with this incredibly heavy emphasis on style and atmosphere and music, and at times obscenely graphic content. And the result was a true golden age of horror that spawned many other careers, and a lot of these classic Italian horror films make so many American horror films from the same era seem almost childish and innocent by comparison. But in that Dario Argento's Suspiria is one of my personal favorites, I was slightly skeptical when I heard it was going to get remade. However, when an art house director like Luca Guadagnino decides to resurrect Italian horror, I finally decided it was a good idea to keep an open mind about the whole thing. And having now seen it, I can safely tell you that this is not some cheesy cash grab attempt at remaking a classic slasher franchise with what is basically a conventional crowd pleaser. This is instead a wildly ambitious, uncompromising, oftentimes ambiguous film, so much so that it'll probably frustrate a lot of people, myself included at times. That said, if you can resist the urge to walk out of the cinema, and I felt that urge a couple times like in the first 20 minutes, I promise you that what is in store for you is one of the most unique, overwhelming, awe-inspiring horror experiences you are likely to have anytime soon. This movie is incredibly long, it's very bleak, it's very grim, it's very gray. At times it's pretentious and narratively incoherent and gets distracted with some useless information. But with that in mind, when this movie cuts loose, and it cuts loose several times over the course of the film, the overall impact for me at least was one of total euphoria. If you consider yourself a fan of the hallucinatory, gruesome, sometimes sexual power of the best in Italian horror, you're going to be absolutely enthralled by this movie. That is, unless you've surrendered to the very justifiable impulse of just throwing up your hands in despair and walking out of the movie. There are numerous very tedious sequences, and I feel like amidst this 2.5-hour extravaganza, there's probably a very tight, economical 90-minute movie that would be an undisputed masterpiece. But the movie has so many ingredients that are absolutely fantastic. Tilda Swinton, Mia Goth, and Dakota Johnson are all incredible. Tom York from Radiohead has cooked up this deliciously eerie score that is unlike anything I've heard in recent memory. In spite of having no interest in dance whatsoever, I was amazed by the dance sequences, because if you don't know, this is a movie about a dance academy, but more importantly, this is a dance academy that is run by a coven of witches. And I think it's safe to say this is probably the most gruesome, lurid, sexual depiction of a coven of witches in the 21st century. So don't think of this movie as a remake of a classic. Think of it as a complete reimagining of the original premise. As much as I might love the original Suspiria, if I were to criticize it, I would say that it places such heavy emphasis on mood and atmosphere and style that sometimes the narrative cohesion of the screenplay is kind of neglected or forgotten entirely. So if you're a fan of the supernatural, and if you're a fan of witchcraft, and if you're a fan of incredibly gruesome, graphic, almost repugnant horror with liberal doses of sexuality, you're probably going to walk away from this movie a very satisfied fan. But that's about all I can say without going into spoilers, so this is my last warning. Let's talk about some specifics. So with this movie, there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad, but before we go any further, maybe I should just do a quick recap of the synopsis. The year is 1977, and Dakota Johnson plays a young dancer named Susie, who has successfully auditioned for this very prestigious dance academy in Berlin. Berlin is embroidered with some political turmoil. In spite of her lack of experience, Susie proves herself to be amazingly adept at taking direction from Tilda Swinton, who basically is the creative director for the dance company. But as every fan of Suspiria knows, or as we quickly learn, basically this dance company is being run by a coven of witches, and this coven of witches has a lot of divisive internal politics when it comes to the leadership, but we slowly start to realize that they're basically grooming dancers because they're looking for a vessel, and the goal is that this vessel can be used to give Mother Helena Marcos a second lease on life. But what this coven of witches doesn't realize is that there's a lot more to Susie than meets the eye. But what I loved most about this movie is watching the way that dance and spellcraft and witchcraft are all interwoven. And that basically by employing all these dancers and these incredibly exotic, incredibly physically demanding rituals, that the witches are able to achieve a variety of effects. In one of the most hardcore sequences of the entire movie, there's a dancer named Olga who's basically had it out with Tilda Swinton in front of the entire company. And as she's marching out of the building, she wanders through this room that is filled with mirrors. And it's right at that moment where Dakota Johnson's character Susie is used as part of an elaborate spell to basically bend and contort and rip this girl to pieces while at the same time keeping her alive. So we have this beautiful cross-cutting going back and forth where Susie is dancing with complete, total physical abandon. And each one of her movements has a horrible effect on Olga, with like her arms getting twisted behind her or her back being broken up and over, or just all the fluids pouring out of her body. But she stays alive throughout the whole process. And at the end, all these witches walk out with these elaborate long hooks and just sink them into her flesh and drag her away to God knows where. Another thing this movie does really well is creating the architecture of this building. That was probably my favorite element of Dario Argento's original film, was the idea of this enormous mansion / chamber of horrors. And while the building in this is very different from the one in Argento's film, you get the feeling that there are all these secret passageways and secret chambers, and they're filled with all these eerie magical relics, as well as these dying, emaciated victims, like the one played by Chloe Grace Moretz. There are just so many secrets to be discovered, or secrets that you may not want to discover. And when Mia Goth's character Sarah is exploring it, it's one of the most terrifying sequences of the whole movie. Dream sequences are a big part of this movie as well, and I'm going to need to go through these dream sequences frame by frame because these montages are so fast and so quick, but the images are so nightmarish. And I feel like these images are filled with a lot of clues that would help the story to make more sense overall, because one of my complaints about this movie is that narratively it's kind of all over the place, but the central storyline is fascinating and I want to watch more. But not since the films of Ken Russell have I seen nightmarish dream sequences like this that had the same kind of power. The biggest surprise to me, though, is that the chief asset of this film was Dakota Johnson, not Tilda Swinton. I think Tilda Swinton is one of the finest actresses of her generation, and her body of work and filmography at this point is absolutely legendary. But Dakota Johnson brings something new to this movie, and I think it's a result of having done all those 50 Shades of Grey movies where she has this incredible confidence and command over the physical side of her performance, and in her auditions, the rehearsals, the performances, as well as this elaborate ritual that takes place at the end of the movie, she displays this incredible physical confidence that I found absolutely remarkable. And I have to say, I'm rapidly becoming a fan of Dakota Johnson. I wasn't necessarily the target audience for those 50 Shades of Grey movies. I never saw any of them. But she was good in A Bigger Splash, which is another film by the same director, Luca Guadagnino. And I really enjoyed her in the movie that came out a couple weeks ago, Bad Times at the El Royale. And I love the fact that she's picking a wide range of different types of movies to get involved with. And any actress who's signing up for a movie as fucked up as this one clearly has a very open mind about filmmaking and which filmmaker she wants to work with. But the best part of this movie is the absolute show-stopping final ritual in this movie, where we're fearing that Susie basically is going to be the victim of this horrible ritual where this grotesque aging witch will basically imbue her body with her own spirit, squeezing out everything that ever made Susie, Susie. And the design of Mother Helena Marcos is absolutely incredible. She's covered with all these tumors. She's completely nude. But amidst the tumors, she has all these like extra body parts. On her arm, she just has this little hand that's constantly flapping. But Tilda Swinton's character, Madame Blanc, realizes something is up because Susie, as it turns out, reveals herself to be one of the three mothers. The three mothers were basically the foundation of Dario Argento's original trilogy. And as it turns out, Susie is actually Mother Suspiriorum. And she's arrived at this coven basically to clean house. And she's basically there to murder and destroy everybody who is loyal to Helena Marcos. And she's walking around the room looking incredibly sexy. She's completely nude except for this like red diaphanous robe. And her chest is this giant like gaping hole. You can't quite tell if it's meant to be pulling in flesh and souls or pushing stuff out. You don't quite know, but she rips her chest open nonetheless. But as she's walking around and addressing those that displease her, she's basically just making their heads explode. And as their heads are exploding, all around them are all these beautiful nude dancers just writhing in pain and in ecstasy, just writhing all around her. It's just this extraordinary bedlam and madness and insanity, combining horror and sexuality and art and dance all into one. She puts Chloe Grace Moretz's character Patricia out of her misery. She puts Mia Goth's character Sarah out of her misery. She frees Dr. Joseph Klemperer, and a lot of people were making a big deal about the fact that Tilda Swinton is playing multiple parts in this movie, including an aging man. He's a doctor who's initially treating Chloe Grace Moretz's character, but when she goes missing, he decides to embark upon an investigation. In any case, he's there at this final ritual, completely nude. But Susie frees him, eventually wipes his memory of all the horrible things he's experienced. And the school returns to normal. The next day, all the dancers are just laughing about the fact that, oh my God, last night was crazy. I had so much to drink. It's almost like this nightmarish fever dream just suddenly suddenly starts to dissipate right before our eyes. But for people who are tired of watching mainstream remakes and recreations or unofficial sequels or reboots or whatever the hell you want to call them of classic American horror franchises, it was such a breath of fresh air to watch a scene where the filmmakers clearly are aiming for the moon and nothing else will satisfy their mad ambition. This is one of those movies where it is completely, utterly riddled with flaws, many shortcomings, but because its aim is so high, when it works, the results are truly extraordinary. So because I'm such a fan of the movie, in spite of its flaws, I don't want to dwell too heavily on the movie's shortcomings, but I do need to call attention to a few. First and foremost, the opening scene of the movie is easily the weakest scene. I love and adore Chloe Grace Moretz. I think she's done some fine work. I've been a big fan of hers ever since she was Hit Girl and Kick-Ass. But the opening scene of this movie where she's talking to her therapist is so poorly executed and so tedious and so dull. It almost feels incompetent. It almost feels like Chloe Grace Moretz has forgotten how to act. And probably 2 or 3 times over the course of that opening scene with her, I'll say to myself, I don't care what's going on in this movie. I'm out of here if this doesn't get better in the next 5 minutes. And as I mentioned before, this movie is long. At 2 hours and 30 minutes, plus 30 minutes of trailers ahead of time, you're in for a long experience. But this movie incorporates a lot of 1977 German politics, as well as a lot of German history, and sometimes the results feel worth it, but more often than not, all these details, rather than fleshing out and supporting the story, they just feel like meaningless distractions, and that perhaps the director Luca Guadagnino could have made an entirely different movie about those distractions. I really do think there's a 90-minute supercut in this movie that would be one of the coolest horror movies of the 21st century, but sadly I have to sift through a lot of unnecessary baggage to get to the heart of the story. And my last nitpicky grievance might have more to do with me than with the actual movie, but I'm a little vague on the details of Susie's backstory. We get a little information about her childhood in Ohio through these memories of her dying mother, and her mother makes some ambiguous references to how Susie came to be. But I'm hoping that upon a second viewing, as well as slowly but surely freeze-framing my way through all these various dream sequences, perhaps I can piece together a more complete narrative of how Mother Suspiriorum came to inhabit the body of Susie, because that was the most interesting part of the movie, and I just want to know more. In any event, I'm going to wrap this video up, but as you can probably gather from the tone of my voice, I did really enjoy Suspiria. I found it absolutely fascinating. But with that in mind, if I bump into people over the next couple of weeks who think the movie is a complete total disaster and a complete total mess and a complete total misfire, I probably won't argue with them, but as someone who loves Italian horror and exploitation films and cult classics, I'm used to the idea of watching a deranged movie that's riddled with flaws so that you can get access to those few scenes where you see something unlike anything you've ever seen before. And that's absolutely what we have here with Suspiria. The 4 or 5 scenes where this movie really soars, I'm never going to forget those moments. So if what I've said sounds appealing, definitely check it out. But I'd also love to hear some reactions from people who are also a fan of Italian horror films, because Italian horror, its golden age, is in the distant past at this point, but it'll be interesting to see if Suspiria perhaps launches a next generation of Italian horror directors. I would absolutely be thrilled if that were the case. But if you want to talk more, you can always help me down on Twitter @Colbrax, or leave me a comment in the comments below. If you enjoyed this little rant, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would really appreciate it. But I can't thank you enough for watching my video and supporting my channel. But more importantly, until next time, onwards and upwards.